Monty Python and the Holy Grail was released in 1975 and was directed by Terry Gilliam and Terry Jones and stars Graham Chapman, John Cleese, Terry Gilliam, Eric Idle, Terry Jones, and Michael Palin, and is a British comedy that satirizes the Arthurian legend and follows King Arthur in his pursuit to bring together the Knights of the Round Table and find the Holy Grail. The film is performed by the Monty Python comedy group, who had previously had their own show, Monty Python's Flying Circus. The film has since gained a huge following and is often seen as one of the greatest films and greatest comedies ever made. That last statement I definitely can agree with. Monty Python and the Holy Grail is one of my favorite comedy films, period, with a top-notch cast, humor, and timeless entertainment. This is a film that was very big for me during my high school years, and I'm so glad I finally got to revisit this one because I had so much fun. And though I wouldn't say for me the film is a complete masterpiece, it's still one of my favorite comedies to watch and showcases the pure creativity of its colorful cast. Holy Grail was first introduced to me in high school when I was part of a chamber choir. What was unique about our choir was we would dress up in medieval and Renaissance attire when performing our music, and every Christmas we would have a dinner and show where the members of the group would create a play set in medieval times and perform it in front of an audience. The plays were a good mix of mystery and action and comedy and romance, and our biggest inspiration for the play was always Monty Python and the Holy Grail. We would watch that movie and lift certain jokes and gags from it and put it in our play. So in a sense, this film holds with it some sentimental value, as I remember the long days working on those plays or performing songs with my friends. But it has been a long time since I had seen this film, and I was wondering if it still packed the same punch I remember it did nearly 10 years ago. Well, I can safely say yes, but I can't say the film is as perfect a comedy as I remember it being, but we'll get into my thoughts on the film soon enough. In the meantime, let's take a look behind the scenes and see just how this film was made. Monty Python and the Holy Grail was conceived by the British comedy group Monty Python, who were, at the time, already pretty popular with several live showings and their own TV show, Monty Python's Flying Circus. But in early 1973, they devised the first draft of what would eventually be the Holy Grail we would know and love today. Initially, the film focused half of its material in the Middle Ages, while the other half was set in modern day. Eventually, they decided to focus mainly on the Middle Ages aspect and make it a story about searching for the Holy Grail. By about the fifth draft of the script, the story was finished and it became what it is now, a farcical retelling of King Arthur and the quest for the Holy Grail. However, the cast noted that they had problems incorporating scenes that didn't really fit with the Grail motif. Financing for the film proved difficult, as members of the group have stated in later interviews. They were rejected by most studios and instead turned to rock bands such as Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin for funding. There's also a rumor from several of the cast members that Elton John helped in the funding of the film, but this has been denied by Eric Idle, but director Terry Gilliam has stated before that he indeed contributed to the film, but we still don't know for sure if there's any truth to this rumor. It also needs to be mentioned that before this, Terry Gilliam and Terry Jones had never actually directed a feature film before, and saw this as their chance to learn about movie making by doing just that. And since Terry Gilliam himself has become quite the prolific director, making several films that have received a cult status, it shows that it paid off. The film was mainly shot on location in Scotland, where they used several real castles or miniatures to get the effect they were going for. As said, the production was composed of people that had never really made a film before, and so that led to problems that sometimes creep up on even bigger productions, such as anachronisms with modern objects ending up in shots. John Cleese notes that one of his funniest takes during one of his big scenes had to be cut because of a coat being seen in the shot. The film also had to pull back on its scale, especially when it came to battle scenes and even having actual horses, because the budget for the film just wouldn't allow it. Overall, the experience making Holy Grail seemed like an interesting one with its own series of trials and tribulations. Luckily for the film, it would end up being a huge success. The film was released on the 3rd of April 1975 in the UK before being released in the US in April of that year. On a small budget of roughly $400,000, the film would go on to gross $5 million. The film would also make its television debut in 1977, but apparently the group was displeased with the editing out of some of the film's profanity and blood that they had it pulled and only allowed it to be aired by PBS, Comedy Central, and IFC in the future. Contemporary reviews for the film were rather mixed, but upon modern re-examination, the film has garnered more respect as a comedic masterpiece and one of the greatest films ever made, and has gained a fairly large cult following through the years. The film's success would even lead to a Tony Award-winning musical inspired by the movie titled Spamalot in 2005. Though many have changed their minds on Holy Grail since its release and have praised it for its humor and creativity, the film has even received some criticism from those who were involved in the film, such as John Cleese, who has stated how dissatisfied he was with the ending, stating it was the ending they came up with, but mainly because they didn't know how to end the film. Finally, with that all out of the way, let's get into my actual thoughts on this film and see how it holds up all these years later. Monty Python and the Holy Grail is one of my favorite comedies, period. As a big fan of British comedy, it's right up my alley and has some of the funniest jokes, scenarios, and memorable scenes for a comedy that I have ever seen. I'm also a big fan of spoofs, such as Blazing Saddles and the Naked Gun franchise, so Holy Grail ends up being a match made in heaven for me, and the film is filled with constant laughs pretty much from beginning to end, with only a few lulls here and there that are a bit too dry for even my taste. I honestly love how the film starts out with its credits, and from the very start shows that we are in for something that isn't meant to be taken seriously. The promotional material for the film even made that clear with taglines that read, "It makes Ben-Hur look like an epic." The credits, though, are these colorful jabs at the supposed people that are in charge of creating the credits for the film, showcasing subtitles that don't make a lot of sense because they're not even in the correct language. It's almost juvenile in its approach, but I think that's what makes it so brilliant. Probably moving forward, it would be best to talk about some of my favorite scenes and gags, such as the opening with King Arthur having an argument about the difference between a European swallow and an African swallow. Or the bring out your dead scene where a man is trying to dispose of the body of someone who actually isn't dead. Then there's the complex and nonsensical scene of the people determining if this one lady is a witch or not, and the list goes on and on. But my favorite three sequences in the entire film are the story of Sir Lancelot, the rabbit, and the bridge guardian. The first sequence in particular had me dying the entire time. It starts out with this prince about to be married, and he just wants to escape and sing, but his father stops him every time he tries to have a musical moment. So the prince, in desperation, sends a note that is retrieved by Lancelot, who thinks the prince is actually a princess stuck in a tower, and he rides to her rescue, slaying everyone in his way in a fairly violent scene that's made even better by John Cleese's excellent comedic timing. There's one moment during this where a guard watches Lancelot running towards him, and as it cuts back to Lancelot running, it never seems as if he's getting any closer, and then all of a sudden, he's just there. Next, we have the rabbit scene where all of Arthur and his knights come together to take on this beast which might be guarding the Holy Grail, and it just turns out to be an innocent white bunny rabbit with a deadly thirst for human blood. It's so funny watching these knights cower in fear, and when they bring out the holy hand grenade, it's just one of the funniest things I've ever seen. Some of my favorite bits of comedy in this film come from how long they'll play a joke for. It's just long enough to maintain the humor, and this scene proves that to me. There's also this great animated bit with a giant beast chasing the knights that's just super creative, and that's another thing I think works with the film, is just a level of variety in the jokes and the scenarios that nothing really becomes stale. Lastly, we have the scene with the Bridge Guardian where they have to each answer 3 questions, and the first 2 questions are super easy, and the last one is either even easier or something incredibly difficult to answer, which causes several of the knights to fall to their death. But the real humor of the scene comes when King Arthur trips the Bridge Guardian up on his own question, and the Guardian ends up meeting his own demise. There's so many great moments like those I've already discussed, but I also need to bring up the performances as well, which I feel like don't get talked about as much in a film that truly is all about the gags. Chapman as King Arthur commands the movie with such a witty yet stern performance. He can be commanding and yet completely silly in the blink of an eye. Cleese is always great and brings consistent laughs, especially in his scenes with Lancelot, which I've already discussed in detail. But we also have Eric Idle, whose iconic voice just brings to life every character he plays and makes them so memorable. That's something I also like in this film, is how the cast plays multiple roles throughout, and they just can so easily transform themselves into these new roles. It's also funny when someone is playing a different character in a scene where they should also be playing someone else, and they're just not present because they're playing a different character. I hope that entire thing makes sense to everybody. But overall, I think this film works just so well. It's consistently funny with only a few dry jokes here and there, and I definitely see why it's put up there as a masterpiece by so many. However, I have to admit, there's one part of the film that bugs me to the point where I can't say the film is perfect. I'm of course talking about what even Cleese has criticized the film for, which is its ending. It has nothing to do with them not finding the Grail. I think that makes sense for the story, but it's such an abrupt anticlimax that the film ends and it just feels off and feels wrong. I'm also just not a huge fan of the modern day segments of the film where a documentarian is killed and we keep cutting back to the crime scene, and eventually that storyline crosses over with the story of the Grail, and it feels to me like pieces of their original idea for the film, where some of it would take place in medieval times and the rest in modern day. It just doesn't work for me and sours the ending to a film that I think is flawless until those moments creep through, but that's just my opinion. I still love this movie nonetheless. It's one of my favorite comedies, and it brings me a lot of nostalgia watching it because it reminds me of those days in high school watching the film with my choir friends and coming up with ideas for our own plays inspired by the film. Maybe with many more rewatches, I'll put it among my pantheon of other films I consider to be masterpieces, but as it stands right now, it's just on the verge of greatness, but just misses the mark. So, with all that said, I'm going to give Monty Python and the Holy Grail an 8 out of 10. This is a great film. It's hilarious and even at times ridiculous, but it has a charm to it that only Monty Python can give us. And I hope to eventually watch their follow-up to this film, Life of Brian, which I've still never seen actually. I hope you guys enjoyed this review, and if you haven't seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, I highly recommend it. But anyway, with all that said, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and stay positive.